Well, our guest today is Dr. Frans Cronje, independent political and economic advisor, and of course, chairman of the board of the Social Research Foundation. Frans, your contributions to BNC 6 were very well received. We've been seeing lots of interest in your talk and in the Q&A part. That's now up on BizNews. And then on the 15th of May, you're going to be opening our one-off conference in London, 2 weeks exactly ahead of the national election. So everything is moving in that direction. Lots of momentum growing. Today, though, you've got the latest numbers on what the political temperature is looking like, and very interested to hear from you. It appears as though the ANC is not having a good day, or certainly not from your feedback.
Yeah, it's a tough day in the office at the Chili House, I can tell you that. Numbers came in last night from Social Research Foundation study. The study is 1,800 respondents, representative in every way, conducted until a few days ago. Margin of error is 2.2% on these numbers. ANC 37%. That's modelled for, I think, a 65.4% election turnout. Second biggest party in the country, the Democratic Alliance, at 25. In third place, we have Mr. Zuma and MKP at 13. The EFF's at 11 and Carter's at 5. And then the smaller parties below that were all at or inside the margin of error. So it's hard to be certain on that. The numbers make sense. About a month back or so, he was also at your event in Hermanus. Bill Johnson, who's been working on marked data numbers, they came out in a very different methodology to what we use at the foundation. A sample of 300,000 face-to-face. I think they put the ANC at 41. And a few weeks before that, the Oppenheimer family and its Brenthurst Foundation, they came out with a number that put the ANC at 39. So these numbers this morning aren't a tangent to what we've been seeing since the beginning of the year. And the last thing I'll tell you, and then you can ask me something, is about a year or so back, and certainly for the 2 years before that, where we did these talks together, I was telling you the ANC is in the high 40s, 47, 48, even at a moment above 50. If you take what MK's got now, the 13, away from 50, you get exactly back to the 37. So the numbers seem to have an internal logic to them. And it's Mr. Zuma's run at the ANC that's pulled them down into the 30s this morning. Alec.
Lots of things to discuss about this, but let's start off with Zuma himself and the MK party. And I'd like to refer you back to an interview that my colleague Linda van Tilburg did with Andre Pinaar about a month ago. He was one of the co-founders of the Scorpions. He runs a very large private equity fund now in the United States. And he was very specific about the fact that Zuma was being funded by the Russians. Now, Frans, it sounds like cloak and dagger stuff, but we do know geopolitics is big stuff at the moment, and we're getting from other sources similar evidence that is now being presented to us. How are you reading all of that? Is Andre on a different planet, or is he actually close to the truth?
Look, I can talk about things that I know. I've built a career of doing that, and over that career developed a good sense to stick to what I have absolute certainty and knowledge of. Of course, South Africa is geostrategically very important, far more so than South Africa, and I think its politicians understand. The South Atlantic Ocean is a piece of geostrategic real estate that's almost as valuable as anything anywhere in the world. If the American Navy can no longer counter China in the South China Sea, probably can't, needs to counter Chinese expansion somewhere, can try at Malacca, If it loses that, Hormuz is lost to Iran. That's really hostile. The gateway to the Red Sea and Bab al-Mandab and all of that is really hot. And the next point to do containment is naval base at Simonstown. And if, for example, China is able to get past that and perhaps park a submarine somewhere of Africa's west coast, Simonstown, Walvis Bay, Bata, Equatorial Guinea. The Chinese Navy sailing from Bata with submarines closer to New York than if they had a base in Hawaii. So the stakes here are absolutely immense from a geostrategic perspective. It would make sense that the world's great powers, all of them, have an interest in the result of South Africa's election. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so we got to realize that this isn't just a domestic issue, that geopolitics is playing its way out all over the world, and there would be interest in South Africa, although often we do denigrate our value given the way that the economy has been performing in the last 10 years. But Frans, how then, if you only talk about things that you know, does one explain the surge in MK? It has to have been funded in some way. Somebody must be bankrolling it.
Well, that I can explain the surge to you. Part one, Mr. Zuma, we are not a Western corner of Western Europe. We are an African emerging market. And while, the chattering classes over the almond lattes cannot comprehend that it's possible that anyone would support Mr. Zuma, he has very strong favorability scores in a lot of important political constituencies in the country. I was speaking recently and explaining Mr. Zuma, and the crowd said, no, it's impossible. Well-heeled crowd, and a big enough crowd. I said, is anyone here from KwaZulu-Natal? One man bravely put up his hand. I said, are you surprised to hear that Mr. Zuma is doing well? He said, not at all. What makes him perform is he is beautifully positioned. He's positioned as the fallen cadre, the heroic fighter for freedom, who has been abandoned by his party, persecuted by it, forgotten about by an aloof and distant ANC, somewhere in the glistening towers of when they glisten of Gauteng, and he's forgotten about us in the hills and valleys of deepest Natal. And that positioning resonates very deeply with a lot of former ANC supporters who feel abandoned, and they see that in him, and so they identify. That's the political magic behind the success. I can go a step further for you and say that at the foundation, we saw back in 2022 that a third of people who then said they wanted to vote for the ANC, 1/3 of that, so they were 50%, it's a third of that's about 15%, exactly the number we see today, were also saying we're going to vote for the ANC, but we really don't want to, and we're looking for something else. So we knew there was a third that could be fractured out of the party pretty easily and pretty quickly. And explained that to a few people. None of the new political startups seemed to be particularly animated with the prospect of doing it themselves and how to do it. And Mr. Zuma has achieved that. So that explains his success. 7 weeks to go still before the election. That's a long time to hold support that is built on frustration and doesn't have a substantive underpinning of a realistic prospect of improving people's lives. So I say to a lot of groups this morning, let this MK, it's a rocket. built on sentiment. Let's see where it settles, when it settles. Might be off a point or two as well. Remember also, this is the record. The ANC can surge in the last days of a campaign because it puts lots of people on the streets. And historically, it's wrestled back a point or two for itself there. And then let's count these votes, these numbers of this morning, and give the margin of error to the ANC. So it's too early to say that anything's crystallized here. The ANC can still go back to the mid-40s. And the extent to which the numbers have shifted just in the last 6 months is the statement on don't lock anything in yet for these numbers. These are not forecasts that we do. The media reports all our numbers as forecasts. We tell them they're not forecasts. It's the current state of play. 28th of May, the evening before the vote, and in the week before that, we're going to do high-frequency polling. So we're going to poll every day for 6 weeks ahead of the vote in this kind of level of detail. In the numbers of the final 10 days before the election, these are numbers that you can, perhaps with some confidence, begin to think of as forecasts of what the result is ultimately going to be, Alec.
As we speak now, it's 49 days to the election. As you say, 7 weeks exactly. It'll be on the 29th of May. And if we imagine the worst case scenario from here, and I know you've said it's only a worst case scenario in the short term, because if you had this doomsday coalition that John Steenhuisen talks so often about, it wouldn't last very long. International markets would be pointing to the unsustainability of it. But if you could give us perhaps what we should be looking out for from here for the next 7 weeks on worst and best.
Well, look, the numbers are easier to get a sense of, and shouldn't be who gets 40 and 45 and whatever. We'll have a good sense. We already have a sense. You already have a sense. You looked at this morning, so you kind of feel that's a lot less important than the important thing, which is what are the politicians going to do with those numbers? Now, if the number is closer to 50, the ANC's got a straightforward option that it's going to take. It's going to get a rat and mouse, and it's going to form a government. It's going to carry on as best as it can. It's not going to change fundamentally. Mr. Ramaphosa will stick around for a year or so. There'll be no profound reform. It'll be what you've seen for the last 5 years. As soon as the number gets below 45%, particularly given what that means for what's happened in Gauteng and KZN, because it's 45 national, the ANC is now in the 30s in Gauteng, and it's in the 20s in KZN. Then you need to start making deals with much bigger political parties. And whether you're at 35 or whether you're at 44, that kind of equation doesn't shift much. It's sensational 30s, ANC in the 30s. The equation stays pretty much the same. So what are there are options, and it's not an exhaustive list. The list still being developed. Now, the first point, no one knows what to do yet. No one has decided what to do. It's not as if answers out there and you can go and pick it up. One option, of course, is that the ANC puts MK and the EFF back into government with it, because on this morning's numbers, it would actually need both to get back. And let's say they then do their worst. They would need the NHI precedent passed so that they can get their hands on the pension fund money, which is where NHI is leading, because they've exhausted public funds, so they need to pivot the cadre deployment and rent-seeking model to private pools of capital to survive politically. They'll try and do that. They might also turn to printing, do a bit of the push towards expropriation and all of that. In the immediate weeks after that crystallizes, this is where it's headed. The shock to sentiment on South Africa will have driven the rand to new levels, and fixed investment to GDP will be in the single figures. What that means is that living standards in South Africa will be in a sharp decline. And what that's historically meant is that support for the party in government is collapsing. Mr. Ramaphosa exits in the middle of this. His exit knocks at least 5 percentage points off the ANC. In fact, the spreadsheet says closer to 10, but at least 5. Thinking that populist vote that's gone in behind MK realizes, because material circumstances drive behavior predominantly, this isn't working. And if we get to another free election, which on the balance of probabilities we will, because to become fascist autocrats, you need, amongst other things, unity of purpose. These groups are divided. You need a highly efficient civil service, which we don't possess, fortunately, in this case. And you need to do end runs through civil society, the judiciary, the media, all of which in time you can do, but 5 years isn't. We've got to battle hard in civil society. So the likelihood is great shocks. South Africa's fundamentals get all out of whack for a few years, and the collective ANC, EFF, MK loses by a landslide in 2029. That's the, on the balance of probabilities, result. Now, the ANC people who know this, they know that, it might sound like great revolutionary kind of moment to all gang up and try and sink the capitalist economy, but you'll be on the receiving end of that. You'll reap that whirlwind very, very quickly. You'll become a regional, rural party. The urban middle classes and the aspirant ones will pass you by. You'll have your last policy conference in Northwest in a marquee as the dust swirls around you. Talk about when we governed in Africa, and you're going to lose. And I think that's a likelihood. So that's some pressure on them not to make that kind of deal, because the practical consequences, they probably don't walk away from. They suffer the most damage of everyone. Second kind of option is to try and invite a government of national unity. So, cabinet, desperate to retain Mr. Ramaphosa because it protects the cabinet's access to patronage, and the slates beneath that what the ANC rests on, these great sort of slates of deployment. Cabinet leans heavily on him and says, listen here, it's 40%, but we've got to turn this into a win. The way to do that would be to say, here's the speech. It's not about the numbers or about winners and losers, right? Politicians are doing. This is a great and historic moment that has been reached. And we shouldn't have been competing so much with each other because we've forgotten about the important thing, that's the people. And what I'm doing now, this is now the voice of, maybe it's Mr. Ramaphosa, it's likely him, is I'm going to invite a group of parties into government. Question is, EFF, MK in that or not? Maybe not. And we're going to hold a national convention. And we're going to do that to find national consensus. And from that consensus, we'll write the national development plan. This is sort of, you kind of heard this story before because it's the distilled essence of the map. We're going to all govern the country together. That's a very important moment, because what answer does the opposition give to that invitation? It would be very difficult to say, no, we won't go in, because markets like this, diplomats, Western ones like this, voters will easily believe in it. And if the opposition says flat no, and in practice forces an ANC EFF deal, even though it wasn't party to that, and even though that's unfair, the opposition will be blamed for every subsequent consequence for 5 years. If it says yes without conditions, it's in perilous territory as well, the opposition, but it's a minority partner in the government that is not motivated to drive the kinds of policy reforms necessary to secure much higher levels of growth, and is littered with corruption. And the opposition could very easily be made jointly culpable for the consequences. And in 5 years' time, voters might look around and say, once we did think the opposition might govern the country better, but they've been at it with the ANC for a few years and it doesn't look a hell of a lot better. And so I don't think there's really we might as well stay with what we've got. So there are more interesting answers in the middle of, this is, people think too simplistically. The answer to the invitation isn't necessarily yes, we will, or no, we won't. There's vast territory in the middle. And answers, and there's so many that you could never cover them on a forum like this. But there's something to say, okay, well, let's think. Let's just think here, the two of us. In these negotiations, it helps to give parties what they want. The ANC wants to be in government. That's what it needs. So, perhaps give it that. A president can be elected with 40% of the vote in parliament, and the minority, and he can then establish a minority government. That's technically perfectly easy to do. It's not a difficult thing. That minority government can be held in place by the opposition, who might say, listen, we're not going into government with you, but we might want key oversight roles, committees on parliament, speakership or something. That's where the opposition's comfortable and strong. And both might fit well together there. And the opposition might say, we will oppose votes of no confidence in your executive in the interest of national stability, not because we endorse how you govern. And we'll help you pass the budget to avoid national crises and win considerable kudos for that. So don't force a shotgun wedding between the ANC and the DA, or try to do that as many people are doing. It's too early for it. Rather, if you lean towards this option, and there are many other options you can lean towards, maybe entertain a courtship along lines similar to this, but there are variations on those lines. And maybe if that holds in place, minority ANC government, and I'm really going down one line, there are many others. I don't think these are the only options. There are many others. You go down this line of a minority ANC government held in place by some grouping of the opposition. Maybe if that works and holds, maybe then we can go from courtship to dating. Maybe a little bit more can be done together. And if you want to be optimistic, and I am, make this work go slowly, make this work in the early stages, and there is a good result on the horizon. That result is this. The DA commands the established urban, multi-generational, middle-class market, which is completely multiracial. The third of the DA's voters in this election will be white, and a third will be black, and a third will be of mixed race. But it struggles to break onto the urban periphery of the aspirant middle class for all manner of reasons. The ANC's last potential stronghold is the black aspirant urban periphery, aspirant middle class, because the rural vote will diminish at the mortality rate and the migration rate. And the ANC cannot crack the urban middle class vote, again, because it's governed very badly. People don't have water and electricity. The like. Coalitions may work best between parties that are not directly competing for the same voter, which is a flaw at the heart of the design of the multi-party coalition, the Moonshot Pact. If we get to courtship, we might get to other things first, and if that gets to dating, the marriage works by saying to both sides, DA side, you command a critical national constituency without which a stable government cannot be built. Be confident in that, hold that, and you've done extremely well to get here. And to the ANC, your future in government in South Africa depends on commanding the aspirant urban periphery middle class. And learn to be comfortable with that. And in government, you two sides, this might be quite far down the road for the country, might find each other. It is one of the most compelling political narratives you can set parties off on as a consequence of the kinds of results, as we reported this morning, that lead to a stable, unitary South African state in which the partners in government both get a lot of what they want out of government and very little of what they don't want. So there you go.
Fascinating stuff, Frans. Thank you for that. For the first time, it starts making sense to me now that the rand has done very little in the past year. It hasn't gone down, which is most unusual for a sliding currency. Somebody knows something, and I got a feeling you know a lot more than even what you're telling us. But thank you for sharing your insights. Dr. Frans Cronje, political analyst and chairman of the Social Research Foundation. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.